Welcome everyone to, I believe, our second Lunch and Learn of the fall semester, winter semester. Welcome to all of our alumni, folks from our foundation office, Alumni Association, Alumni Center. I'm Joseph Richmond. I'm the department chair of our Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management department here in the College of Nursing and Health Professions, and it is my honor today to introduce Andrea Davis, who is the Senior Director of Global Emergency Management for the Walmart Corporation, a little retailer that some of you might have heard of. Comes from humble beginnings. She leads the team responsible for preparing for disasters, developing business continuity plans, and managing crises to protect Walmart associates and their customers. She's been involved in emergency management since 1999. She joined Walmart early here in 2020, coming from California. She has been unable to explore her new home state of Arkansas thanks to COVID, but we hope to get her to Northeast Arkansas and to our campus soon. Prior to Walmart, she was at the Walt Disney Corporation, where she served as Director of Global Crisis Management. And prior to Disney, she served as the External Affairs Director for FEMA's Louisiana Recovery Office, overseeing all media, intergovernmental, and congressional activities for one of the U.S.'s largest disaster recovery efforts, with a total recovery portfolio of over $25 billion. She has a passion for volunteer service. She was selected as the inaugural Emergency Manager of the Year by the International Association of Emergency Managers. She serves as Vice Chair for the Northwest Arkansas chapter of the American Red Cross. She is a new member of our department's advisory board, and she has a whole list of current and prior service activities. And so in getting started today, many of you have sent questions in previously. She's going to try to weave those into her presentation. And if any more come in or she misses any of those, I will add those on at the end. So without any further, Andrea Davis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond, and thank you, Director Blackburn, for this opportunity. I consider the program that you have at Arkansas State the best in class, and so I truly am honored to present today. And how I was going to approach today, our next kind of 45 minutes to an hour together, was share a little bit of my background of my career so far in crisis management and emergency management, and weave it into how my day job today with the Walmart Corporation. And then I'll leave time at the end to make sure I get to all of your questions, because obviously we've got some wonderful news with the COVID-19 vaccine coming out, being rolled out. So that's really excited. So I want to make sure we get there and get to all of your questions. So as Dr. Richmond said, I made kind of a major life change at the beginning of this year. On January 6th of 2020, and not knowing what this year was going to be like all of you on here, I had no idea what was in store for me, but I left Pasadena, California, and the Walt Disney Company after 7 years, and got on a plane with 2 suitcases and my cat, Mr. Boo. And I started here in Bentonville, Arkansas, and with the Walmart Corporation. And I took this job, and I was so excited to take this job because it was going to be a new challenge, new opportunity for me. But by the time we get done with today's presentation, you might question my life choices, just because obviously, 2020 definitely was a challenge. And I knew taking over for the world's largest company and running their emergency management program would present that. Seriously had no clue. And so I'm so excited to share with you today. So I'm going to share a presentation. Let me get my screen up. Let's see. Can I get a thumbs up from you, Dr. Richmond, that you see it? Awesome, thank you. All right, so as Dr. Richmond said, I started in the field of emergency management back in 1999. And so at the time, I had done another kind of like big life change. Was in my second year of law school and realized it was not my life calling. And so I dropped out of law school and I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And I was looking for a job and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. At the time in the state of California, if you had a bachelor's degree, you could substitute teach. And so I was teaching fourth graders. And I quickly kind of figured out that was not my life calling either, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I answered an old school classified ad that was advertising to work with nonprofits for the city and county of San Francisco to teach them emergency planning. So I had no idea what emergency planning was, but in my thought process was, well, I've now been teaching fourth graders and I had not killed them. So maybe I might be kind of suited personality wise for this job. So I decided to throw my name in the hat. And taking you back in time for a moment, in 1999, there was a lot of focus on crisis planning, Y2K. And so I know we have some current students and younger folks on here. So for my millennial and Gen Z friends, Y2K, we were anticipating the world's end. And so there was a lot of focus on making sure that if indeed we lost all of our electronics, our banking systems, we'd have crisis plans in place. Well, thankfully, the world didn't end. And I got the job, which was super exciting. But now I had to kind of figure out what was I, what did my job mean? How was I going to teach nonprofits throughout the city and county of San Francisco emergency planning? And so I was very fortunate that my first boss, who was the director and worked for the mayor's office at the time, is where the Office of Emergency Management was. The reason why he picked me for the job was it was all about kind of the personality, because he said, if you can get a fire chief around the table with the police chief, let alone bringing like debris management, human resources, and other cities functions around the table, I've done a great job. And he said, emergency management is all about collaborating and facilitating those subject matter experts to solve a problem. And that was really attractive to me. And I thought, well, this is really exciting. And so here's an exciting opportunity to bring together all of the city resources, especially on the nonprofit side, which in San Francisco is a very diverse community. And at any given day, there's over 57 different languages spoken. And so bringing them to the city structure, if in a day that they might have like a major disaster. For San Francisco, their major risk was planning for earthquakes. And in 1989, they had a big earthquake. It's their largest in kind of recent years. And so they were always kind of planning for that. And so my job was to kind of connect all these dots. So to go out to the nonprofit community and help them understand the importance of emergency management. Now, all of you that have spent any time doing crisis planning, even if it's simple, like where do I need to evacuate from this building? How do I get safe? Know that it is not a sexy topic, and that getting people engaged in this and to sit down and to talk through the planning process is really, really challenging. Even to this day, to be honest, it's challenging for me in the private sector. And so I really, as a new learner, right, dropping into this field, not knowing about it, I needed to really figure out how can I communicate the message and what's important about emergency management to these nonprofits that I'm now responsible for training and educating them. And so it was really, I wanted to make it a very simple process. And to me, it was just like to always answer the question, how best do you invest your time and money? Those are always limited commodities that we have. And so, and especially in the nonprofit world, when they're all about services to their constituents, and they don't have the time, they don't have the money to invest in this. So how can I communicate to them to say, this is actually will help them and help them deliver services. So it was really grassroots, I would say, getting down to the basics of like, okay, we know some of our big risks up here in San Francisco were the big earthquakes, the big ones coming, right? But what is usually the number one hazard that can take out a physical structure is a fire. And looking at it from that lens of saying, let's spend 5 minutes to figure out, does everybody know how to get out? How are we going to communicate with folks? And then how are we going to get our operations back up and running so that we can make sure those services can still be rendered, both at that micro level and then connecting obviously back up to the city. Just one quick aside, I felt very proud of myself. I designed this business card for myself. And so that's, the little seismometer there. And then this agency emergency plan that I created for the nonprofit is actually still on their website. And I'm so proud that this nonprofit still exists. And it was received funds directly from the Red Cross after that '89 earthquake. So after kind of getting my roots in the really truly learning this value of how you can create resiliency at that very basic level and making sure it's engaged at that community level, I transitioned from the nonprofit world to the federal government. And I went directly from the nonprofit to the U.S. Attorney's Office. My first day with the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco was September 11th, 2001. And like many of you on this call, I felt that I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't even exhale that day, because just observing the impact that it had on that day and then the lasting effects. And I would say, Dr. Richmond, you could dedicate an entire semester to talking about how September 11th changed the field of emergency management. But at a micro level, what it did on the federal government side was require each federal agency to have an emergency manager. And so in 2001, with this complete systemic change in how we thought as a nation, and remember in 1999, that's when we thought the world was ending. It just fast forwarded to 2001, where the world, we knew it was changing, but we just didn't know how it was changing. And so the movement of thought leaders that were in the space of emergency management with the development of Homeland Security, the agency, and moving FEMA under there, we saw a lot of change. And we saw at this point a movement to have national response plans for federal agencies, and that making sure that there's emergency managers that are at each of the federal agencies. And it wasn't clearly defined in the early days. It was, is that emergency manager just there for the evacuation plan, the basics, get people safe? Is that emergency manager there to actually write plans, emergency plans? Or are they there for continuity of operations to keep things going from a federal level? So there's a lot of moving parts, and obviously on the focus on prevention and making sure that the different federal agencies can communicate and local entities can communicate with each other, because that was one of the major challenges in September 11th. Just the local fire and police weren't even on the same radio channels. So you had this complete, I would just almost say systemic change to how the industry was looked at, and then a piling, right? An overcompensation of like, we got to do this, we got to throw in a plan, we got to have to do this, we got to throw in stuff, we got to buy stuff, everybody needs stuff. And there is warehouses all through San Francisco of all the stuff that was purchased after September 11th. And the challenge with that is there were no plans on how to use the stuff, nor people trained on how to use any of it. And so for all these years, it sat there with no use to it. But there was some seedings of hope at this time of when it was looked at a national level to have how are we going to respond as a country? We obviously, FEMA had been in place since the 70s. So we did have guiding principles through the Stafford Act on telling us how to respond. But FEMA, everybody's very comfortable with FEMA in the space of natural hazards. The terrorism side, which was typically under the jurisdiction of the FBI, was not something that FEMA would take the lead on. And I'm going to plant the seeds now for, going into our future conversation. And FEMA traditionally was not the lead for public health emergencies either. The comfort level was always natural hazards, but the philosophy was sound from a planning standpoint. And so coming back to my little micro world, end up in 2001 being one of those subject matter experts, because I'd gone through Y2K from an emergency planning standpoint and said, well, I can help with this. I want to help. And so I go from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the 12th District Federal Reserve, which has jurisdiction from Utah out to Guam. It's the largest of all the Federal Reserve banks. And the interesting thing here, and this is an important nuance to remember, is that the Federal Reserve banks are quasi-federal agencies. They're not considered a federal government agency. So any of those plans and structures that the federal government was investing in, the Federal Reserve banks were not part of that planning process. They're considered similar to the post office. So both the post office and the Federal Reserve banks weren't part of the overarching national response plan process. And it's important to remember as I kind of fast forward us in time when we get to Katrina. And so it was a great opportunity to make this switch over from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the Federal Reserve. I got to work and to help tell the story of how the Federal Reserve responded during September 11th, because it was definitely one of those things that you want behind the scenes. It was never overt. All the Federal Reserve said on September 11th was they were open and operating, because having faith in our monetary system was first and foremost. Those fears that I was mentioning about 1999 and Y2K was that one of them was they couldn't get access to currency. And so this curriculum that still exists, which also I'm very proud of, like if you were to Google open and operating and the Federal Reserve, this would come up. It's a video curriculum that we designed for high school seniors studying economics, to kind of show the behind the scenes, because it's twofold as far as the mission of the Federal Reserve. Obviously, monetary policy, setting it from a very strategic high level with your interest rates, but then also the movement of money. Back in 2001, you had physical movements of money going, and checks, right, moving. And there are stories of Federal Reserve employees, especially in New York City, that were actually, getting deputized to move money to certain banks and locations, because the Federal Reserve doesn't own the armored carriers. Those are outsourced by the banks. And so you had a lot of functions that on a good day coordinated very well together, but on a bad day, and with no plans in place, it was really just sheer force of will of how things were kept going all behind the scenes from an economic standpoint. So it was great to be able to be part of that and tell that story. And so what I learned here when I made this transition, both from my leap from the nonprofit world to the federal world, is the plan, you got to have emergency plans, but the physical written document is not what's important. It's the process, and making sure that you've got the right folks around that table to have that, to develop the process. And if only a select member of those people know the plan or the process and how you're going to respond, if you haven't communicated it, you're going to have a complete failure of your planning process. And that's what I saw as we rolled into Katrina. And to me, in my career, I still, as far as most impact, I'm very similar to September 11th, when I saw it happen, and you see what happens in New Orleans specifically. It makes you stop and to see, and especially because this was the United States, and we have such great process and protocol and structure in place. But for what I saw was a complete failure of that, because there were many people who were not around the table when the development of a national response plan was put into place. And I told you, I was the Federal Reserve banks are quasi-federal, so they weren't part of that conversation. The post office wasn't part of that conversation. And when you have a catastrophic crisis, like we saw in areas of New Orleans, Biloxi, basically throughout Louisiana and Mississippi and parts of Texas, that movement was very challenging. You couldn't get in or out. And I at the time when Katrina hits was the only emergency manager for the Federal Reserve System. And I was told, well, we've got to get things moving, right? Because part of a crisis situation is that you've got, how can you recover if you don't start kind of getting the economy up? But when you had parts of Louisiana underwater for 6 weeks, there was nobody's getting in or out. This is a picture immediately following an area of the 9th Ward, which was one of the areas hit hardest by Hurricane Katrina. And so my orders are, we'll fix it. And so I get placed in what was called a joint field office in Baton Rouge at the time. And again, there was a little bit of like, let's throw everything that we can at this problem. We know it's a problem. We know this very bad thing happened. So it was very disjointed. You had a lot of federal leaders, state leaders, local leaders, all together going very different directions. And how the federal government operates is they cannot, at the time, you cannot go into a state unless there's been a declaration. And we don't see a declaration, an actual declaration about Hurricane Katrina, still one of our largest disasters, until almost 2 weeks after it occurs for the state of Louisiana. And so there were all these experts and all of these resources kind of thrown at the problem, and no one talking, no one listening. And then here's little old me from the Federal Reserve who they're looking at as like, what are you doing here? How can you help this? We got people underwater, there's people on the roofs. We can't even think about going forward. And so it was, for me, from a career standpoint, my biggest lessons learned was witnessing this, and then helped me set my career in motion on that. First and foremost, the only way we can recover is making sure that we are collaborating in that recovery effort. I still remember when I left the Fed and I basically begged FEMA to hire me. I applied to 12 different jobs, and because I just fell in love with New Orleans, and I just, when you, in your heart, you want to help. And again, this is where you might question life choices, because they finally hire me year 5 FEMA after the BP oil spill, which actually worked to my advantage, because this is the first time in 5 years there was a different organization that was actually hated more than FEMA, but I'll get to that in a minute. And so what I learned was there is no true resiliency, there is no recovery unless you're collaborating and you are listening to what the people want. And going back to my roots, that micro level, what I learned, how can I help a nonprofit get back up after a crisis? How can I help a community if I'm doing it in a vacuum? And that's exactly what I saw. It's just like we had DC basically telling local governments what you need to do. And so like handcuffed almost to arcane legislation. Stafford Act was passed in the late 70s, and so there was things FEMA could do and couldn't do, and actually for again a micro level to completely rebuild a structure, it has to be more than 51% damaged. Well, if you're underwater for 6 weeks, a firehouse, you structurally may not look like you're 51% damaged, but with the black mold that's growing, but there was no structure in place, at least from a legal or legislative structure, to say, City of New Orleans, rebuild the way you want to rebuild until year 5. And it took an act of Congress to petition and start the Recovery School District for the City of New Orleans to rebuild their schools the way they wanted to, and really invest in the community. 5 years kind of fighting that, on top of dealing with devastation, just like in this picture. And so you start seeing movement, and just to be able to be, like a small part of that was just so awesome. And so my role when they finally hired me was to head up external affairs, tell the story behind the recovery effort. At year 5, we have a new president. President Obama was just coming in. This was not his, it didn't happen under his presidency. So it was a different president's disaster, quote unquote. And we just had the BP oil spill. So this area had been so devastated. And it wasn't just Katrina. Rita came right after, 3 weeks after. And then Ike and Gustav a couple years later. And so, but it was just almost like static, a moment in time. And when you look at it, but you start seeing movement, you start getting to, I get some good bits that I can start tying together, and my team can start telling the story about it's going to come back. And so about year 6, we start seeing massive rebuilding going on. And so here's the same area where they're groundbreaking it now to create a park. And this is the 9th Ward in New Orleans. Like I mentioned, one of the hardest areas hit. Right in the center's mayor. He was the mayor at the time, Mayor Landrieu, who took over. Again, he kind of inherited this. At the time, he takes over the same year as President Obama takes over, and his sister, Mary Landrieu, heads up the Homeland Security committee in the Senate. And this was huge because you now had kind of a little bit of a force in nature moving for an investment into the recovery efforts. And you really saw it even on different political sides. The governor at the time, Governor Jindal, a Republican governor, but it was lockstep. And the reason why we got to this point is we talked to the community. And I still, to this day, to the far left was the executive director of the recovery office, the gentleman by the name of Joe Threat. He was a local. He lost everything. He did 3 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart veteran. He did not have to come and take this job with FEMA, but he wanted to help rebuild his community. And he listen to me. So to give you some context, when I got this job with FEMA, I was so excited because like I mentioned, I was so in love with New Orleans and just wanting to help. I left San Francisco. I drove from San Francisco to New Orleans with the same cat, Mr. Boo, and 2 suitcases. And it was I'm Andrea from San Francisco. I'm gonna help with the recovery efforts. And day 1, I was called Frisco Red, and they just thought I was crazy. But my boss, so thankful, my crazy idea of saying, we got to do community meetings. We have to reach out to the parish presidents and the mayors and get them on board with the recovery. We have to listen. There were billions and billions of dollars being poured into the state of Louisiana, but there was no strategy, and there was no collaboration. And after some really tough community meetings, and again, Dr. Richmond, we could do a whole semester on this, and people throwing things, but we toughed through it, and we were able to get the buy-in and to get here, right, where we're doing groundbreaking. And so here, year 7, same area, look at this park and how beautiful it is. And you only get here with community collaboration at all levels, putting politics aside and saying, how do we want our communities to come back? To this day, hands down, I just, in my heart, this was my best experience professionally to be able to play a small piece of this, and on the schools that we were able to rebuild. And I still remember some of the young students who won't remember, the kids who were playing in this playground, they don't remember the devastation that led to this amazing park that's in this community. But then they got to see the impact of what their community rallied to bring. And I just remember this young boy tugging at my shirt, and I had a FEMA shirt on, and he said, FEMA lady, look at me. He had a backpack on, and he said, I'm going to college, because he was in one of the new recovery schools. And it just, that feeling of warmth to be able to help with that was awesome. And I will say, in my career, This is one of the few times I actually had true measurable results on if my plans were working. Because when FEMA was first there in Louisiana, they were being shot at because they were so hated. By the time I leave, in the local paper, the Times-Picayune, they were saying, thank God for FEMA. They coined a new acronym for FEMA. So that's true measurable results. And really any job where you're not being shot at is a good job. So just quick aside on that. So if this isn't dramatic enough, I decide, this was my last groundbreaking that I had the opportunity to do with the recovery office. There was this job posted. There's the International Association of Emergency Managers, and it was for the Director of Global Crisis Management for the Walt Disney Company. And so I'm looking at that going, now I've done the nonprofit world, the kind of the banking world, the federal government. And so I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, what in the world, what kind of problems does Mickey have? What, you know, I was just like more fascinated than anything because I didn't really see how I could translate what I was doing to the private sector. So in 2012, that same cat, and so he's a very hardy cat, he's 15 now. I get on a plane from New Orleans to Burbank, California is where the headquarters for the Walt Disney Company is. It's actually the original studio lot that Walt Disney built. If you ever have the opportunity to go, I'd love to be able to give you a behind the scene tour on my old team to give that to you, but it was a quite magical place to be. And anyways, get on the plane with the 2 suitcases and a cat and start my new career into the world of entertainment and private sector. And so I had no idea, again, what was truly in store for me, because I'm really looking at it from the perspective of, look, I just came from, Hurricane Katrina recovery work. We were responding to a hurricane when I was leaving. It was a hurricane for a minute, Hurricane Isaac, in 2012, and I was sleeping on a cot in Baton Rouge, and so I get on this plane, and I'm just thinking, I've hit gold, right? This is the Walt Disney Company, and this is going to be so much fun. And I quickly learned the definition of crisis is very different in the entertainment world than what I am used to. I made the mistake of parking in a producer's spot and quickly learned that's a crisis. And, when you make $1 billion in a weekend, like some of the Marvel movies were doing at the time, they don't really care that you're the director of crisis management. They don't even know what that is. And I kept trying to convey like, oh, I'm like a wedding planner, but instead I plan for crises. And so I quickly learned I was going to struggle being relevant in my new environment. And so I learned the importance, not only from like being culturally relevant, and I say it with a big C and a little c, because culture came in many different ways in my new environment. You had the Disney universe of all of its enterprises, which I had no idea until I joined the company. And, from ESPN, and you never would call an ESPN a cast member. Oh no, they're teammates. And they don't respond well being called a cast member because they're still bitter that Disney bought them. Certainly you don't call Lucasfilm or Marvel, Pixar cast members. And so knowing very fast that even within my own new job that I'm so excited, I couldn't even say Mickey, right? Because Marvel people don't want anything to do with Mickey. Lucasfilm people don't want anything to do with Mickey. And so not only am I having this topic that is very challenging to talk about, I don't speak the language in my new universe. And in my 7 years with Disney, I went to 49 different countries. And so each country obviously has a different nuance on how they approach one communicating and dealing with a crisis. What could be perceived as a crisis for us in the US very differently than say in India or China. And even certain words, I remember working as Disney was building the park in Shanghai and working with local police and the fire and bringing up this idea of collaboration, going back to my roots of saying we can't build a program without everybody around the table, and bringing them to the table. And that wasn't a word that was translatable. They didn't, because it wasn't part of their ethos. So having to figure out how to design programming and being able to communicate, I learned some very, very valuable lessons during my tenure with Disney, of using the magic of all of it is, when I'm at Lucasfilm's facilities, their emergency kits, they don't have flashlights, they have lightsabers. Of course they do. So I had the best brand, and I still wish back when I was with FEMA, like you had, look at all on the screen, all this fun things. I can make emergency preparedness fun, and we're able to partner on a number of times because I was also the brand ambassador to the Red Cross, with the Red Cross to make disaster preparedness fun and make it relevant to kids with the Pillowcase Project, and then did a preparedness book, which was actually translated into Mandarin and Cantonese, because little known fact, Disney had English language centers throughout China. I had no idea. And writing an emergency plan for an English language center or school, I was remembering back to my teaching 4th grade, and like, just don't kill the children, and focus with that lens. But making sure, and it's to my advice to anybody who's getting into the field, and just good practice, right? Always ask yourself, who's missing from this conversation? Who's missing from the table? And are all needs and perspectives being addressed? And this really, not only did this was, I would say, stretched out coming to Disney, but obviously learned during my time with FEMA, because those two questions were not being, they weren't being answered. So late last year, the predecessor who has this position with Walmart, my current position, the senior director for global emergency management, said he was leaving. He happened to be a friend of mine. When he posted he was leaving, I said, hey, what do you think about me? Do you think I would be a good fit? Because I remember back with Hurricane Katrina, if there was a hero to that story, it was those Walmart trucks coming in with supplies. And remember, I showed you that picture of that devastation, and just seeing the line of trucks. And the company itself learned a lot of lessons from that experience, because again, they got in the trucks and they were sending down, but if you can't get through, if you didn't coordinate with local police or the local city officials, you aren't going anywhere. So the company learned lessons too. But I remember that visual, and I'm like, boy, if I could join that team, and it'd be a new challenge, right? And though I made the leap to private sector, but come on, it was the entertainment business, right? It was very different, very diverse. I had cruise ships, and like I said, the productions, and obviously theme parks. So an incredibly diverse universe that I had to get used to. But hey, this is the big dog. This is the giant. This is Walmart. And so he thought I'd be a good fit. I threw my name in the hat. I left Disney January 3rd. I started with Walmart on January 6th. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my day job. And this is my theme 5 of my life. Continuously reassess. Because I thought, right, coming from what I just dealt with Disney and dealing with that, to me, very challenging environment, and having the lens of the federal government and nonprofit, I was like, I can do this. It's my universe is going to be bigger. But to be honest, I had no idea how big the Walmart universe was. And of course I knew, right? I knew all the stories. I knew Mr. Sam and what he built, and that is the world's largest retailer, but I didn't quantify it really, truly. And then my second week on the job is when we really start to see the coronavirus pop up in Wuhan, and Walmart has a large presence throughout China. So we activate our emergency operations center to support our teams in China. And then we see this progress, across Asia, and then obviously into the United States. And then the team, we've been in a virtual state since mid-March. But so this was my scope that I walked into. And with thinking back, reflecting, like I almost am glad like I didn't really comprehend the totality that was Walmart, because I'm not sure if I would have gotten on that plane with Mr. Boo. Because, and especially if I had any foreshadowing of what the COVID-19 was going to do for us from an emergency planning standpoint, because what made this very difficult, you know, I am in a new environment being in Arkansas, and I so look forward to the day to be able to explore and see this wonderful state. But I was in Southern California, and before that, Louisiana. This white stuff that fell from the sky over the weekend, no experience. My first week here, there was some ice. I'm all excited that I found the garbage can in the apartment I was staying at when I moved here. Because remember, I just had my cat in 2 suitcases. I didn't have anything because this was this crazy idea I'm going to do. And I hit my head on ice and literally taking out the garbage and fall backwards and throw the garbage. And there's times I actually think I might still be in a coma and covered in that garbage, because and it was really just that hit in the head was just like, oh, you have no idea how different your space is and how different Walmart is. I didn't know the language. I don't know retail. They kept saying words like GNFR. And it's not an abbreviation for Guns N' Roses, just FYI. It's goods not for resale. And so like there were teams designated to this. And so I had no idea of the complexity and how big it was. And until, you know, I'm head first, literally into this, into my new environment and into this new world. And so my program has kind of 5 units to it. We have the planning side, both on front end crisis planning and business continuity. We have a preparedness program, emergency operations, which I'm going to share most of this with you a little bit. We have the recovery function. So think of if a fire impacts a store, we have a team that responds and helps that store recover. And we're talking, you know, any store that's out, we're talking about $23 million. You know, so the economic impact. So my world is like, that's blown away. You know, that's a store, that's a Walmart store. It's $23 million a day when the parks, Disney World closes. So that's comparison of scope for me. And then also we have a technology department that was all under my umbrella. I'm like, ooh, I have amazing resources. But what did I remember what I said about the FEMA days is like, there were plenty of resources available, but if you don't know how to use them, you don't know who to talk to or collaborate with, they don't do any good. So we designed our emergency operations center for Walmart space loosely, I'd say, on the federal government, what FEMA has, so very familiar. And you have an alumni that joined us today, Chris. He happens to be one of the emergency support functions, and so I feel his support, and because we definitely needed it, because my team is small, and when we have a big bag day, just like we've had with COVID, all the hurricanes this year, the wildfires in California, there was this random thing called a derecho in the Midwest, which is like a landlocked hurricane. Never heard of it before in my 20 years, but that has an impact. And so we pull all these functions to come sit in our EOC. And usually we're sitting there, but this is what our EOC looks like today. And remember, I was in transit. I'm sitting on a box there, bought a house in beautiful Bentonville. And it took me, you know, because we're in COVID, right, a long time to get a desk and get myself set up and trying to maneuver all this. But so this is our EOC. And at times when, especially during like, I'd say March and April, and even into May, when we were really into the heat of COVID, we'd have about 500 people join our virtual EOC. And it's just a Zoom, just like this. And we keep it 24/7 live, so we can drop in. And we rolled right from the COVID right into the civil unrest. And just to give you some of the scope, most years for Walmart, we'd have a really busy year from a response would be 20 EOC activation calls. And this is pulling all the players together. That's everybody in that EOC coming together and responding. And this 139, and this was as of November 1. We've actually had some subsequently, and these are obviously COVID was a bulk of that, but many days for civil unrest and weather related events, and just it was to me, thinking back, this was a Katrina, this was a September 11th, as far as game changing on how emergency management in general will be handling crises going forward. Because there's been some benefits, right? Being in this virtual space, I'm very used to the team we deploy folks to other EOCs especially during hurricanes. And at the beginning of COVID, I actually deployed somebody on the team to go to DC to be embedded with FEMA because it's important to make sure everybody's on the same page from a response standpoint. COVID obviously presented challenges with that. And so you had to create a virtual space where you felt like you were in the room. And so it kind of forced all of us to be very transparent with our communications and making sure, like, who don't we have here? Oh my goodness, are you seriously? New Orleans isn't on, or Lake Charles isn't on, and it's Hurricane Laura. We got to make sure all those right players are around that table. Just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of snapshots of like how we kind of were able to convey that message in a virtual space. And we share this information and data both to the federal government and to Red Cross. And actually our system, we use Esri mapping in the GIS side of this. It's all shared and open source because for a lot of communities, a Walmart ends up being their only resource. So making sure that that local community and those first responders knows what's open for them is really helpful. And then you can access this if you went to walmart.com and went to the corporate website, the link on there, you can see what facilities are open and what's impacting us. And this helps give us that common operating picture. And if we were back pre-COVID, right, we're all working in our own silos and rarely sharing this information unless I had somebody embedded in an EOC. So it made us kind of say, how do we make this accessible and be able to share it? And I want to go back to kind of want to end before I kind of stop sharing my formal presentation was, you know, still having to focus on, you can't forget, where you have to keep preparing and thinking about the going forward. And it's really hard in a time of crisis, right? We're still in the thick of COVID and we got hope coming, but that other bad things don't stop. You know, we had just gotten to kind of, I would say, like a pace responding to COVID, and then the civil unrest happened, and the unprecedented year for hurricanes and the wildfires in California. I mean, it's devastating to watch my state and my hometown burning, in things that we've never seen before. And so keeping an eye on preparedness and trying to make it fun and engaging in a time of crisis. Kudos to I have a team of one who is kind of focused on this. And as you can see, we kind of leverage bad days. That picture of the truck down below, that's Hurricane Laura, that's Lake Charles. And we actually used a Walmart that was open to help FEMA stage for individual assistance because it was the only thing accessible and open at the time. So really kind of sharing that and trying to think about things and make preparedness just like brushing your teeth. That it's got to be commonplace, because if you haven't thought about this, you haven't collaborated before, you know, you can, any of the stories I can share with you, you can see the outcome to them. So this is a picture of beautiful Bentonville that I love, and I can't wait to explore the rest of the state. But this is my projecting a light. This is my bat signal to you guys. When we get through all this, to invite you to come in. I'd love to show you my EOC. It is the best in the world. Don't tell FEMA I said that, but it is awesome. And I can't wait to physically share it with all of you. And so I know I have probably shared way too much, and I don't know. I should take one of those Zoom polls to see if you question my life choices or not. But I want to kick it to you, Dr. Richmond, for questions that I know I didn't get to the vaccine ones, but just to kind of kick off questions.
Okay, that was a great presentation. I know I enjoyed that, and you did weave a lot of answers, I feel like, through the questions, but since we have a little time left, we can touch on those. And we might as well start, as you said, with the vaccine questions, because those are the topic of the day, and they're finally giving us some hope at the light at the end of the tunnel. So what's Walmart's role in that going to be? So what type of discussion is occurring related to the distribution of vaccines, especially to at-risk individuals in their homes? Is Walmart going to play a role in that? And there was a question about educators. I'm not sure you can speak to that. That's more of probably the Arkansas Department of Health answer that question, but those are the two vaccine related questions that I've seen.
Great. No, and they're awesome questions. And I like all of you. It's just like once I saw the announcement that they're coming, oh my gosh, it was just like, oh, it's like the Walmart trucks coming into Katrina. It was just like, oh, help is coming. Like you feel that way, and that we won't have to be in the Zoom box anymore. Just broadly, that since the beginning of this, and especially, I'll take it back to testing sites, when there was the task force, the president built the task force specific to COVID-19 in conversations on how to engage the private sector in testings. And so that planning, we were at the table for that to participate in it. But we fall obviously within the national strategy, which then feeds into the state strategy. But so it was so awesome, one, to be at the table, because even I think going back 5 years, I'm not sure if the private sector necessarily would have been considered at the table. And an interesting shift, what I saw just at the federal level, FEMA typically is not in charge of a public health response. And once the task force was up and going at a federal level, they decided to shift it under FEMA, at least from that broad umbrella of like, to think about it from I would say, big picture, holistically for the whole country. This is the first time we've ever had a national declaration outside of a wartime that every state has been activated. And I could talk to you for an hour on the challenges of dealing with the different regulations that were coming out in March. Cities were passing regulations of what we could and couldn't do from a Walmart perspective and coming in, then states on top of it, and then federal government. It was a nightmare. We tracked over, it's now, I think we're up to 5,000 different orders that were changing minute by minute. And so to be plugged in and part of that, and now with the vaccine coming, the strategy, and it was actually, I saw published in the paper today, and it will, and Dr. Richmond, you're correct, this is going to come through the Department of Public Health, but they are engaging the emergency management community in how this will be rolled out, because first responders, those ones who've been on the front line, are kind of first and foremost, who are getting the vaccine first. Then they want to go to the most vulnerable of the community. And so those who are living in long-term care facilities are also kind of in that tier 1 group. And then second tier is going to be your essential functions. And I believe that's been defined differently by the states. And so it will model the states on how they define essential functions. And in that bucket where I saw, actually that was published today, that educators were in there, and higher ed was listed in that kind of second tier. But when you think about it from a strategy, we're not looking at numbers, right? The vulnerable population could be, millions of people. And then when you get to that second tier, that we could still be looking at a March projection for that to get to those, what is deemed essential personnel. But as we just had the second vaccine come online that's being distributed, and I think there's a third in the works. And Walmart is standing at the ready. When it gets to that point where it's going to come to our pharmacies or our clinics, we will be at the ready to be able to distribute it. And so we're at the moment just making sure that we're engaged in those communities and able to do that. With that, we have the process in place to support as needed.
Great. So since time is running short, I'm going to try to combine two questions that came in early. And you spoke to a little bit of this talking about the vaccine, but what does industry bring to the game that FEMA cannot when it comes to commodity distribution and logistics and things like that? And how difficult has it been to apply global solutions in this environment to 50 different states and different countries and all of these different entities?
Hard. I don't have a good answer. I mean, it was, none of us, right, have been confronted with this. And like I was saying, just from the government orders, just staying on top of it, like, Okay, Austin says we have to close our doors at 10 to do a deep clean, and they define deep clean differently than New York did, and New York's lockdown, and then compound that with China, and obviously different cultures and rules, and being a different government structure in China, right? People listen to government orders and follow instructions. Chinese government says you're shut down, you're shut down. When you're an essential service, you're an essential service. And we were very fortunate. Walmart kind of was put to action. And I would say very similar to here in the States, like we were, making sure people got food delivery throughout China. And well, I would say the benefit of working for the world's largest retailer, when we started, a lot of products are made in China, right? And so resources, especially on PPE, were very, very limited. And so once we're seeing this, the market closed down and shut down, and the Chinese government saying anything built in China stays in China, we were able to pivot to some of our other markets in Latin America to focus on PPE and get those supplies out. And just, I would say, Dr. Richmond, staying on top of the demand. That when we were dealing with the supply chain issues, and this was a respiratory illness, and that we had shortages of toilet paper, shortages of water, like things that defied common sense to me or logic. I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. There was a day in the UC, there was a shortage of trampolines because all schools were, sent home, and parents were going to lose their mind. And so there was a mad rush for trampolines, and never in a million years would I think that I would have in my executive report to the top executives of Walmart that I'd be saying, hey, we got a shortage of trampolines. So I think staying on top of it. When I wanted to, one quick thought about the vaccines, on the corporate website, just like you can see the testing sites, which testing sites are available, that they will be announced there as well. So that as soon as that information becomes available, I recommend go to that site, because you can type in your zip code and see not only where you can get a test, but then also where there might be vaccine availability.
Since time is very short, we have a few questions that I might be able to get answers working with you later to push out, but let's end it on a fun question in there. It's completely off topic. What's your favorite Bentonville restaurant?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I love the food. I have to say the Hive is fantastic. It's like a little boutique little place right in the town square. It's awesome. It's absolutely awesome. And like I said, there will be a day you will get an invite to come see me, and we will have dinner at the Hive. We will have a great time. And at the old Walmart museum, the Five and Dime, Mr. Sam's, they have like a space that they have where you can look at the Times Square, the town square. It's so nice. It's so beautiful. And I just, Dr. Richmond, and thank you and Director Blackburn for this opportunity. And I'm just andrea.davis@walmart.com. As you can see, I can talk about emergency management forever. And I will tell you, I'm going to leave you on a teaser that my most embarrassing moment happened here at Walmart, briefing the top executives. And never do you ever want to flash the top executives at the Walmart company. And I will tell you how I did that. And the next time I talk to y'all, I'm going to keep you hanging.
So, well, with that, I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
I just want to say thank you both, Dr. Richmond, Andrea. You guys were amazing today. We have recorded this session for everyone, and if anyone has any other questions, feel free to email us, and we will get with Andrea and try to get her to maybe answer a few more questions for us. But that wraps us up for today, and I hope everyone has a happy holiday season.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Thank you.